On Anzac Day, I remember my great uncle. I never knew my great uncle because he was a flight navigator in the Second World War and he died in war. I do remember his photo on my grandmother's bedside cabinet, and I remember the great stories that my grandmother and my dad told us as we were growing up. Those stories helped to keep his memory alive. And I also used to love looking at his name on the wall at the Auckland War Memorial Museum. Words have a very special time at Anzac Day. Words and stories that help us to keep our memory alive. Like the poppy that I'm wearing at the moment, which is a symbol of remembrance for all those who sacrificed their lives in the wars so that we can live lives of freedom and peace. This is a very special poem. It's called the Ode. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. That's very special to me. What's your Anzac story?
John Patrick Galvin, World War I, 1914 to 1918. George Leonard Hawkins, World War II, 1939 to 1945. So what does Anzac Day mean to me? It means to my family a time to be proud and grateful. It's a time for my children to think about and be proud of their great-great-grandfather and their great-grandfather who both fought and returned home in the hope that the world would be a better place. So what does Anzac Day mean for me? Pride, gratitude and reflection.
Anzac Day is a day when I think about my grandfather. He went to the war when he was just a young man in Italy and he was a motorcycle mechanic. When he came back, he didn't really talk about the war very much, and we never celebrated Anzac Day because he didn't like to celebrate war. But whenever Anzac Day is on, I do think about my grandfather and grandmother and all the sacrifices that they made when they were young.
Anzac Day is an important day for me because it always reminds me of my granddad. He was in the Royal Navy at the time and fought at the Dardanelles. He used to talk about it a lot when we were children. So it reminds me that we were all allied at the time, our countries, and we worked together then and we work together now. So it's a nice day for remembering that.
Anzac Day reminds me of all the people in my family who went to war. Most of them came back. Here's my grandfather. I remember him. He came back. My grandmother, she came back. My grandmother, with her brother in the picture, he came back. My mother and my father, both in uniform, they came back, or I wouldn't be here. My mother-in-law and my father-in-law, they came back too. My father-in-law spent his war years as a prisoner of war. He was captured at Dunkirk at 19. I wonder about this young man. He would have been my uncle if he had survived. He did not come back.
Anzac Day is a national day of remembrance for Australia and New Zealand to commemorate those who have served and died in wars, conflicts and peacekeeping operations. This year I will be standing at dawn with my community, observing a minute's silence and listening to the last post.
Anzac Day is an interesting time for me because I was born in Zimbabwe, so I have no ancestors that fought at Gallipoli. However, when I moved to New Zealand, I was interested in how this holiday was celebrated. So I went with a group of friends one year to the dawn service at the Auckland Museum, and it was the most incredible experience. I very clearly remember the eerie feeling of silence whilst amongst thousands of people, and then hearing the last post being played was just incredible. This memory is something that will stick with me forever.
Anzac Day for me is about remembering those that have gone before us and the sacrifices that they've made. It's about realising that the luxuries and the freedom that we have today is because of the losses of the past. So I used to attend dawn parades when I was in the air training corps, and I remember listening to the last post, and even though I wasn't physically there during those war times, you could almost feel the people's pain as you listened. So it's just about remembering the reason that we have the things we have today is because of the sacrifices that previous generations have made for us.
Anzac Day means in the Ashby household that we remember our granddad who fought in one of the world wars, and he was lucky enough to come back as well. I remember going to the dawn parades with him when he was still alive, and he would be dressed up in his uniform, and it meant a great deal to him to do that. Didn't often talk about it, but on Anzac Day we remember him, and we remember also our Nana and the great courage they showed and the sacrifices they made so that we can live like we do today.
New Zealand is at war. Anzac, Australia and New Zealand Army Corps, reminds us of our first call to arms as New Zealand soldiers and Australian soldiers went to fight in the First World War at Anzac Cove. Many of those men, they went there to protect our freedoms, our rights to be able to express ourselves freely, our rights to make our own free choices in life. Unfortunately for some of those men, they didn't make it. They gave up their lives in order that we could have those freedoms. We have a different battle today, a very real battle in its own sense. We need to remain strong as well. Kia kaha, tamarikis.
Kia ora everyone. Well, this Anzac Day is certainly going to be a little bit different than the ones in the past, with us all being in lockdown. However, nonetheless, we can all still celebrate the special day that's held every year on the 25th of April. It commemorates those soldiers from Australia and New Zealand who went and landed in Gallipoli in 1915. So the first Anzac Day wasn't actually celebrated until the year 1916, and every year since. I try and go to the Anzac parade every year, and we try out different ones each year, whether it's the museum or Papakura or at retirement villages. So we just try and celebrate it and just remember those who went to war. So lest we forget everybody.
My family holds Anzac Day closely to our hearts. My grandfather, my dad's dad, he was in the Second World War. He was an aircraft engineer, and he was stationed in Egypt during the Second World War. At the time, my dad was only 2 years old, and my granddad told him he was going down the road to get a haircut. Thankfully, my granddad managed to come back a few years later, but my dad was much older by then. Every year, my granddad would buy me a poppy. And it was really special that he would give this to me, and we would go to the local dawn services, and we would remember those people that didn't come back from the war and what war means and how it separates families across the world. So this year we'll be standing at our letterboxes instead of going to dawn services.
I remember Anzac Day in 2009 when I watched the sun rise over the enormous cliffs in Gallipoli, Turkey. I had spent the cold night in this very sleeping bag, thinking of the thousands of Anzac troops that had been here before me. I took part in the Anzac Day ceremonies there that day, and will never forget the sacrifices that were made there by many.
Anzac Day for us is a time to quietly reflect and remember the true horrors of war, but also a time to be incredibly thankful and grateful that we haven't had those experiences ourselves.
So when I think about Anzac Day, I think about honouring and remembering all the men, women and animals who served New Zealand in a range of different wars throughout the years. When we first think about Anzac Day, we make that connection between New Zealand and Australia going over to Gallipoli during World War I. But I think it's a day to remember all of the people that served in the different wars. So my great-grandfather, he was involved with World War II. So he spent most of his time over in Europe, in Italy and Egypt. He was one of the lucky ones. He came back to New Zealand, although when he came back, he wasn't really ever the same again. He did not want to talk about the war. We weren't allowed to ask about the war. Even though I was very, very little, I know my mum wasn't allowed to ask him about the war. He had a lot of nightmares and he just didn't really want to talk about what happened over there. So that was my great-grandfather, and my granddad's brother, he went over more of it as a peacemaker to Japan during the Korean War. So he served over there. So when I think about Anzac Day, I like to think about my great-grandfather. I also remember my brother and I going to dawn services and walking in the parade. We would wear my grandfather's medals. He received the Egyptian Star and the Italian Star for the World War II, and it made us feel really, really proud to wear his medals. So when I think about Anzac Day, I think about my great-grandfather in particular.
Anzac Day to me is about honouring and remembering all of the brave men and women that fought in both World War I and World War II. I actually had two family members that fought in World War I. So I had my great-great-great-grandfather, Grandfather Stuart. He fought over in France, and he was one of the lucky ones. He actually made it home. He snuck home with him a sword from one of the battlefields, so he put it down his trouser leg, and he hobbled all the way home, and he pretended that he had a broken leg, and we still have that sword today. My other great-great-great uncle, his name was Fred, he fought over in Belgium, but unfortunately he didn't make it home. So to me, Anzac Day is about honouring and remembering not only those family members of mine, but everyone who fought in the wars for our freedom and for our rights today.
Yeah. So this is my papa. He's my dad's dad. His name was John Simcox, and he fought in World War II. So my papa, he was a bit of a crazy young man when he went to the war. He drove a tank that had a bridge on the top of it. So he was often one of the first people into dangerous areas, because whenever the ground got uneven, the tank would go down, it would put the bridge across, and then all of the rest of the soldiers and vehicles can go over the top. My grandfather fought in Egypt and in Italy. So it was a nasty battle in Monte Cassino that he fought in, and he lost lots of his friends. He saw lots of his friends die in front of him. When he was in Egypt, he got quite sick and he was sent home. He came home with lots of medals, but I never got to see them. He hid them away. He didn't want to talk about the war. We learned quite young never to ask him about it. When my grandfather died at his funeral, they had a soldier who played the last post with the bugle. And every time I hear that now, it makes me feel very sad. So that's what I think of when I think of Anzac Day. We do make the effort, the Johnsons, to go at 6 o'clock in the morning, and even if it's raining or cold and dark, we go to the dawn parade. And we will be doing that at our letterbox this year because it's very important. Not just because my grandfather was an amazing man, but because there were lots of amazing people who fought in the war and who still fight in wars. So that's what Anzac Day means to me. Thank you.
To me, Anzac Day is a day where we can remember the men and women who fought and served in the war. It's a day where we are able to show our respect and honour those who lost their lives and the families that were left behind. For me, my great-great-grandfather fought in the war. His medals are living in my great auntie's cabinet at her house. This year, to pay my respects will look a little bit different than other years. I will make a poppy and put it on my letterbox, joining the other poppies along our road.
For me, Anzac Day is about having an opportunity to reflect, remember, and to give thanks for all the men and women in the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps who made so many sacrifices so that we could have freedom and live the lives that we do today.
When I think about Anzac Day, it often makes me think about my great-grandfather, who wasn't actually allowed to serve in the First World War because as a child he had polio, and so his leg was removed, and you obviously weren't allowed to go to war with only one leg. But he often had stories to tell about that time growing up and being a young man whilst all of his friends went off to fight the world wars. The other great memory I have is from about 7 years ago when I went to my first dawn service parade with my best friend whose grandfather did serve, and I remember waking up and it was so cold, and we all rugged up and walked down, and the sheer number of people that turned up for this just amazed me. It was such a beautiful and thought-provoking time where I considered, how lucky we are to live in this day and age.
On the 25th of April 1915, New Zealand and Australian soldiers formed part of the Allied expedition that set out to capture the Gallipoli Peninsula. Most of those who died on the 25th of April have no known grave. They are commemorated on the Lone Pine Memorial at Gallipoli. A number of years ago, I travelled to Anzac Cove in Turkey for a dawn service on the 25th of April. It was eerie. There were many people there, but no one spoke into the silence, because we knew where we were standing. We walked through the trenches in silence. We saw the beach where the Anzacs had landed, and we were filled, all of us, with a deep sense of awe at the sacrifice that those men made so that we could have freedom. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. We will remember them.